Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to give you an introduction to programming in PHP. Now the purpose of this video is to give you enough information to get started programming in PHP. That is to give you a bit of an overview of PHP, to let you know the different tools that you need to code in PHP or to begin coding in PHP, to let you know how to set up a local host server to test your PHP scripts, and to let you know or to give you advice on hosting providers so you can upload your scripts to a server and actually have them accessible over the internet. So I'll get started right away. Now I'll start by telling you what PHP means. PHP is a recursive acronym and stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. It was created by a gentleman named Rasmus Lerdorf in 1994. I'm almost certain I pronounced at least one of those names wrong, probably both, but yep, that is the man's name who created PHP over 2 decades ago. Much of the syntax of PHP is borrowed from C, Java and Perl. So if you have experience with any of those languages, then you'll see some familiar syntax and code when using PHP, but it does have its own unique specific features. The goal of the language is to allow web developers to rapidly write dynamically generated pages, and it does that job pretty well. Now with programming and coding languages, there are 2 different groups that they can fall into, and that is server-side languages and client-side languages. PHP being a server-side language, and what that means is it runs on the web server, as opposed to languages like HTML, CSS and JavaScript, which run in the browser. If you've got any experience with HTML, you'll know that when you are creating a static HTML page, you'll create the page, add your code, whatever you're adding to it, and then you'll transfer it to the server via FTP or some other way. Maybe you're using Git, or somehow you'll transfer it to the server, and then if you want to make changes to that file, you'll download it, or if you're using Git, then you'll just make your changes and you'll have to transfer it to the server again. Now this process can become quite tedious, and it's quite old-fashioned. It's an old way of doing things. When using PHP, you can have it dynamically generate the HTML page for you using data from a database or text files, etc. A good example of that is Wordpress. I'm pretty sure everyone knows what Wordpress is, and if you've ever had a Wordpress site, you'll know that you can log into your site via a browser, and say for example you have a blog post, you can edit that blog post via the browser when you're logged in and make your changes, and then save it, and you'll see those changes immediately. Now behind the scenes, how that actually works is there's a database which is MySQL, and essentially when you request that blog page, the request goes to the server, it hits PHP queries the database for whatever data it needs, it gets any text files it needs for rendering the data, and it puts it all together and then sends a response back to the browser as a HTML page. So in that sense, PHP acts as an intermediary between you, the user, and a database or text file. And because of this, with a small amount of knowledge of how PHP works, you can create some pretty impressive websites. I mentioned databases, and that is because PHP is particularly well suited for interacting with databases, the most common one being MySQL. In fact, you'll very often hear PHP and MySQL mentioned together because they pretty much go hand in hand. I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that most websites that use PHP also use a MySQL database. I'll move on to some tools that you'll need to start writing your PHP scripts. The first thing is a text editor, and when you can use something as simple as Notepad or Mac's version of Notepad, it is not the best piece of software for the job. I'd say a step up from Notepad would be a piece of software called Notepad++, and when you're first getting started, it is more than suitable, for your usages. It has things like syntax highlighting, so different types of code like arrays, functions, variables, constants, etc. will be different colors, so you can easily differentiate between them. And if none of those words made sense to you, don't worry. If you continue learning PHP, you'll know words like that like the back of your hand. Now, yeah, as I said, Notepad++ will be more than suitable for your needs, and the only time I'd say that you should move on to something a bit more powerful is when you're creating fairly large applications that have functions in one file that are calling a function in another file, and using classes and things like that. Then you'll probably want to move on to using an integrated development environment, which is usually referred to by its acronym IDE. Now, they have features such as autocomplete and go-to declaration, which means that if you're using a function, if you have a function in one file and it calls a function from another file, you can use your keypad shortcut and it will take you to the declaration, so you don't have to know where it was declared or look through files to find it. You can just do quick keypad shortcut for go to declaration and it will get it for you, no problem. You also have a project-wide search, so there might be a string that you want to search for throughout your entire application to see how many times it occurs in the application, and you can do that in an IDE, no problem. Or you might want to do a search and replace, so instead of just searching for that string, you want to replace it with another string throughout your entire application. You can do that as well, no problem. And there's loads of other features that they have. There's free IDEs and commercial ones. One of the more popular free ones is Netbeans, which I used for a number of years, and it had some great features. It was cross-language, so you could code in Java, in PHP, and yes, it was a cool piece of software, especially for free. Now, I'll mention one commercial one which I've started to use recently, and that is Phpstorm. And of course, when an IDE is commercial, or any piece of software is commercial, it has to justify why you're paying for it when there are free alternatives. And I will say, my experience with Phpstorm, it is very good. With Netbeans and other ones, there may be small bugs and sometimes things don't work as well as you'd like them to, and you accept that because at the end of the day it's free. Now, when you're paying for something, of course, these things are not acceptable, and Phpstorm, everything I've used it for has worked. I've never had any issues with it, and it has got some really cool features in there, so I do think it's worth paying I think it's £14 a month or $14 per month, or if you pay for like 6 months or a year in advance, then you'll get it cheaper. But yeah, those are the two ones that I'll mention now, and as I said before, you don't really need to worry about them for now, because Notepad++ will suffice. But down the line, if you start building more complicated and complex applications, then you'll probably want to move on to an IDE. Now, if you want to test your scripts locally, you're going to need to set up a local host server. If you've used HTML before, you'll know that you can create your HTML page. You might name it index.html, and you can view that page directly in the browser without any special type of software or anything like that. Now, PHP is a little bit different because it's an interpreted language, so you need the interpreter which comes with PHP when you install it on your local machine. So you need to set up a local host server, essentially. And there are a couple of options here. You can download an all-in-one AMP stack. So an AMP stack stands for Apache, MySQL and PHP. And there are pieces of software out there that combine all three for you. So you just install that one piece of software on your machine and it does all the hard work for you, essentially. and there's a couple of versions for Windows that are quite popular, named XAMPP and WAMP, and there's a version for Mac named MAMP. And if you want to get things set up quickly, then that'll be the better option. I made a tutorial on how to set up XAMPP on your Windows machine, so I'll include a link to that video in the description to this video, so you could just follow along that, and it'll make the process even simpler for you, and you should be set up very quickly. Now, the second option is to install the components yourself, so install Apache MySQL and PHP yourself. And this is a bit more tricky, there's a bit more to it. You have to let Apache know where the PHP is installed, and set up a couple of other things that will be taken care of for you if you use the all-in-one option. But there are pros and cons to both. The pros to the first one is, of course, you know, a lot of things are taken care of for you, and it's, you know, it's a quick install, just and it does most of it for you. And the pros to the second option are, you have, when you install the components separately, you have more control over them. So for example, you might want to upgrade PHP to the newest version, and if you've installed Apache MySQL and PHP separately, you can just uninstall PHP and install the new version, no problem, it'll be fine. But if you use XAMPP, you are kind of stuck with the version of PHP that it comes with. It can be quite restrictive in that sense, so you have less control. So I guess you'll just have to weigh up the pros and cons yourself and think which is the correct version for you. And you can actually have both running, which I do have on my local machine. I have WAMP, in fact, running, and another setup where I've installed the components separately. And the reason for that is I wanted to have two versions of PHP, and WAMP comes with version 5.6, and my custom setup, I have the latest version of PHP, which is 7.1, I believe, 7.1 point something. And yeah, the reason for that is I have some older applications using Drupal 7 and older versions of WordPress that need an older version of PHP, or if I to use a new version, I'll have to start changing stuff. And I wanted to test the latest version of PHP as well on some custom projects and Drupal 8, etc. So that's the reason for that. And yeah, I'm not sure if I mentioned that I actually made a video on how to set up a custom AMP stack, so installing the components separately, and I will also put a link to that video in the description to this video. So whichever option you go with, if you follow along to the tutorials that I've made, you should be set up in no time. Next, I will move on to hosting. Now, to get your feet wet and just, you know, to get started, I would suggest just getting cheap shared hosting from a company like GoDaddy or 1&1. You could get it for around £5 or maybe even cheaper, and you know, it will more than suffice for your needs when you just, you know, you're just getting started and want to get a feel for the process and how it works. A couple of things you're going to want to make sure. The first is that you have FTP access to the server, because you'll need that to transfer your files over. The second is you want to make sure that it supports PHP, and the third is you're going to want to make sure it supports MySQL. Now, these things are kind of a given with hosting. You know, pretty much any hosting provider will provide these things if they're any decent anyway, and you know, they're in this current decade, they will support these things. But it's best to be sure that they actually do, because you don't want to start paying for it and have it set up and then realize that it's not fit for purpose for what you want. So yeah, that is, now I've got hosting out of the way, I'm going to talk about FTP, because I mentioned that a minute ago and you might have been thinking, what on earth is that? FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol, and there is a secure version called SFTP, which of course stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol, and that is the most common way of transferring files from one machine to another. So it could be from your local machine to a remote server, etc. So once you've created your PHP scripts, you've tested them locally, you want to upload them to a server that is accessible over the internet, you'll have your FTP connection details, and you'll enter them, connect, and that's fine. Now, of course, I said secure, so I'll mention why it makes it secure. Essentially, when you transfer files via FTP, they are sent in plain text. So if a bad guy managed to intercept that data transfer somehow, they would see the files being transferred in plain text, so they'll see everything inside them. And secure file transfer protocol encrypts the files. So again, if someone managed to get hold of those files while they're being transferred, they would not be able to. It would make no sense to them. It's encrypted, and it's can only be decrypted on the other side of the connection. So it's a connection from your machine to the other machine. It's a secure connection, and it can only be decrypted on the other side, unless the bad guy has the key to decrypt it. Then they can't. So it's just a more secure way of doing things, and it is pretty much the standard way to do things now is via SFTP, not FTP. Okay, so I'm actually going to create a simple PHP script just to show you how it's done. I'm using Phpstorm for this. So, got my project open. Right, let me get rid of that. New PHP file. I'll name it example.php, and you'll see, of course, PHP files have the .php extension, and PHP code can be embedded in HTML code, which is one of the great features of it. And essentially what that means is that any HTML code can go in a PHP file. So literally any code that you would put in a HTML file, whether it's CSS, whether it's JavaScript, whether it's HTML, whether it's an include to a JavaScript file, or including a CSS file, etc. All of that can go inside a PHP file. And additionally, PHP code can also go inside a PHP file, and it will be in between PHP tags. So that's how when the PHP interpreter is interpreting this file, it knows which code is PHP and which code is not. It's because the PHP code will be in between an opening and closing PHP tag. So for example, I could add a H1 HTML element there, and then also in here I could add some PHP code. And this will run perfectly fine. So I'm going to remove the H1 tag, and I'm going to leave this call to this PHP Info Function. Now what this function does is it gets information about the PHP installation on the server, or on whatever machine it's running on. And the information includes the version of PHP, its configuration settings, where its ini file is, etc. And I will demonstrate the output of this file now. Actually before that, I'll talk a bit more about Filezilla, which is Filezilla is an FTP client server, and it's one of the more popular ones for transfer. It's one of the more popular FTP clients. It has a FTP server and an FTP client. You don't really have to worry about the FTP server, because of course that is running on the server, and that will be provided if your as long as the FTP is provided by your hosting, then the FTP server will be on the server. So what you need is the client. So you'll download the client and install it. I of course already have it installed, so I'm not going to do that, but it's a simple process. Then once you've done that, you're going to enter your connection details, so your FTP connection details, which will be provided by your hosting provider. Now you'll need, for the host, you'll need an IP address or domain name or host name, whatever you're using. Then you'll need a username and password. The port could normally be left blank because the default should be fine. The default for FTP is 21, what it says, and the default for SFTP is 22. And yeah, almost all of the time they will be left standard, so you don't need to worry about adding the port number there. If you want to save the connection, so you don't want to enter it each time, because entering the details in here does not save the connection, then you'll click this button here and it will give you the option to save a connection. That is what I had done earlier here. So I'll use to connect, and I'll transfer the file that I just created over, example.php, and then see the output of that file. Yeah, as I mentioned, it shows information about the PHP installation. As we can see, it's version 7.1.8-2, etc. It says information about the system. It's Linux, localhost, Linode, the build date, server API, etc. Here is the php.ini file that I mentioned earlier, and this has information. This is where you can configure certain values such as max execution time, memory limit. I'll show you some of them now actually. Yeah, we can see max execution time here is 30 seconds, which is the default. Memory limit of 128 megabytes. Now these settings they help make sure that your scripts are written efficiently, because if your scripts are memory hogs, they're using lots of memory, they're probably not written very efficiently. And again, if they're taking too long to execute, they are also probably not written efficiently. So these values help to ensure that your scripts are well written and run efficiently. If we go further down, you can see some more information about you can see information about extensions that are installed: mbstring, mysqli, mysqld. These might not make much sense to you now, they probably won't, but again, if you continue learning PHP, you'll learn more about these things as time goes on, so you don't worry too much right now if you don't have a clue what these things mean. So yeah, I'm going to leave the video here. I hope you've got enough information to get started with PHP, writing some PHP scripts and get a feel for what it's like to actually transfer them over to a hosting provider and have them accessible over the internet. If you did find this video helpful, you should share it with some friends if you've got someone else you think could benefit from this video. And be sure to watch some of my other videos if there aren't any more currently on PHP. Don't worry, I'll be making videos like weekly, hopefully a few a week, so there'll definitely be something new for you to watch soon. And until next time, take care.